Maybe I should begin by asking Rabbi Rappaport if you would wish a rebuttal, or would you like to comment on that, or should I just open it? Actually, I do have a question for the professor, though. It's a unique interpretation of the whole issue of the golem, but do you think, though, given the very real issues that you see we are facing here in bioethics and science and so forth, you think the paradigm of the golem through history and what has been written about it serves any useful purpose in terms of what we can derive in dealing with these issues, or is it a basically fanciful and meaningless type of construct?
My answer is quite positive. Quite positive, meaning our entire culture is based on the same principle. Alone is difficult to confront new problems. So we turn, that's why I use the term proof text. Culture is based on proof text. So the golem is not the only proof text in the world, believe me. We are using all the time proof text in order to be inspired, to find authority, to show that we are knowledgeable, that we are not the first, we are in a line. So from this point, the golem is not an exception, it's us.
But just to follow up on that, and then I'll call on you, Rabbi, many of the asmachtot, and well, let me put it like many of the legends and so forth that we see, the agadot, are clearly fanciful, but we do derive, at least we feel we derive, very meaningful principles that help guide us in our actions. Do you think the golem can be useful in that way?
Yes, for sure. It is helping us to think again something that otherwise is difficult. So we are using this material to be inspired. That's what they said, to be inspired, which is something very positive.
Are you inspired by the story of the golem?
I hope that no.
You hope not.
I hope, but you know, that the others should judge.
Well, that's an honest answer.
Something doesn't have to exist in order to be relevant. You know, so many things that exist are not relevant. So there are many things that don't exist that must be relevant in order to balance, to give us a balance. Yesterday, Dr. Lenki gave a brilliant speech during lunch, and I think I counted, he used the word magic no less than 13 times. After 13, I gave up. And what he meant, I understand, I think by magic, he thinks that would have seen magic a few years ago, or 10 years ago, or 50 years ago. Depends on the thing that he discussed. When Yehuda Leib Gordon, the poet, tried to show something that is fanciful and crazy, the Jews waste their time in order to consider, he talked about a sugya in Bchorot, it's called Madbik Rechamim. He discusses there a batlan, you know, a scholar, Torah scholar who deals with fanciful things. It's when you move uterus from an animal to an animal, whether the firstborn is really considered to be a firstborn. Now, this issue is now is a source of many discussions, many stem cells discussion in halakha. So whether the thing exists or it's fanciful is irrelevant. I can invent a story, and like they do in all the exams in law, and make up a story and instill the elements that I need in order to discuss. So the golem is such a test case, it doesn't matter whether it existed or not. Do I believe that it existed? Chachamtzi believed that it existed. Why he believed? Could be that Professor Eidley is right, but I think it's part of the things of reality. It doesn't matter whether they're relevant, whether they existed or not.
Questions from the audience? Yes, sir. Please speak up loudly.
My question is to Rabbi Rappaport. It's speaking about the distant future. What is your opinion on the tradition of Etzem Alus, of the born resurrection? Can this tradition be used to justify human power?
Could you repeat the question, Rabbi, please?
Yes, there is a tradition that the reason to eat a meal on Motzai Shabbat is because it's the only meal that supports the loose bone, the bone that from this a person is created again in afterlife. can you use this bone as and I think this is the question, as a source of information from which to create a person. Actually, you know, the creating of people from information is really, I think this is my interpretation, could be it's too fanciful, too creative, but I really think I saw signs in the Rab Sadia Gaon's Ma'amar on Tchiyat HaMeitim. He says that people asked how come it's possible to recreate a person, and he says as long as the information exists, and Kadosh Baruch Hu has all the information, there is enough material in the world in order to recreate a person. So I don't think it's too fanciful, and I think it's relevant.
Any other questions? John?
Could each of the panelists describe for us their definition of a human being?
A very simple question. Dr. Whiteley wants to know if any of the panelists can give in 5 words or less their definition of a human being. Who would like to start?
Rolly.
It's easiest to quote, right? I can quote Kipling or Twain. Well, I would go with Twain. The only animal that blushes or needs to.
The only animal that
Blushes
or
needs to.
needs to, okay? That's a simple definition. Rabbi, you want to try that? Is there a halachic definition of what it means to be human?
I think our instinctive approach, intuitive approach is the right one. Anything that is enough like me, not too different than myself.
Mm-hmm.
This is a human being. What is the degree of different than myself?
Mm-hmm.
This is already, whether it's his religion, whether it's his behavior, his appearance, this is already debatable.
Professor Goldstein, you want to give a shot at that?
Well, being a biologist, that's sort of difficult. That's sort of like being asked how to define life, which I think people a lot smarter than me have a lot of trouble doing things like that. I can't say something that would get accepted to Bar-Ilan to study biology. That would be a good definition, I guess. But
Perfectly utilitarian definition.
yeah, I think I'll leave it there. Thank you.
And the professor.
The golem was described as non-human because he didn't speak. So in the text I'm acquainted with, the human is something which is thinking and speaking. I would add to this issue also arguing, because that's not enough to understand, because we know it's artificial intelligence, and not enough to speak. For the time being, I would add the golem never argued. So that's why it's not a human being, even if it exists.
Certainly not
Clearly
Jewish.
not Jewish.
Clearly not Jewish.
No question.
מה עם הגולם של בן
If I
סלע?
might add to that,
הגולם של בן סלע שאתה
Professor,
חותם עליו?
Professor Schultz,
לא, שהוא
would you
נותן
accept
מוסדית, הוא לא
the
מדבר.
definition of not speaking, should we broaden that to say the capacity to speak? Because there are people who have strokes who cannot speak, who are clearly human. There are infants cannot speak who are clearly human. So if I may add the capacity to speak, is that fair?
Yes.
Okay. Let me ask, I would actually like to ask the Rabbi and Professor Goldstein, taking this chimera idea a little further, let me start with you, Professor Goldstein. Do you have any ethical constraints or limits where you would feel it inappropriate to blend the DNA of animals and humans? Are there any areas where you would draw the line?
With DNA, actually not. Cells, I might have a problem, but
Or
with
cells, I'm sorry.
okay, I got myself in trouble. With DNA, there's this experiment that was discussed yesterday. It made all the headlines about generating DNA and replacing it and redefining bacteria at our own will. I think we're very, very far from doing that in people. I don't think, I shouldn't say everything that science fiction from last year is already science today, so it's hard to say that these things can never be done. But looking at the difficulty we're having in doing nuclear transfer, normally known as cloning with human cells, I think the idea of moving enough human DNA into an animal cell that it would make enough of a difference that it would be an ethical problem is something technically unlikely to be. In terms of cells, I don't know whether it's a gut reaction that I think a lot of people have or whether it's actually a real scientific basis, but I also think that the experiment that was done at Rockefeller, that I didn't go into details, but I'll just mention in 2 sentences, what they did was they took human embryonic stem cells, which can make any cells in the body, and they put them into blastocyst stage embryos. That's the stage of the embryo where basically all the cells can become everything in the body. And had this experiment worked, quote unquote,
Blastocyst
of a mouse,
of a mouse. Okay.
and this is what the intention of the NIH was to prohibit and is to prohibit. Had this experiment worked like it does with putting the same kind of embryo, a mouse embryonic stem cell in a mouse embryo at this stage, you get 50% and 80% chimerism, and you would have much of the animal being human. And that scares me in terms of, like I said, gut reaction, and I think that ethically, halachically, I have nothing to say. If it works, then it's permitted. I mean, the Tiferet Yisrael says. But I think as a person, if one is allowed to distinguish between being a Jew, a halachic Jew, and a person, the idea of making a creature that would have a tremendous component starting at such an early stage that would be human, that I would have ethical qualms with.
From a halachic point of view, Rabbi, is there anything that you can...
I don't think there is any halachic prohibition besides the Isur of Kil'aim, which
besides the...
Isur of Kil'aim, crossbreeding,
Kil'aim.
which could be avoided if it's done in an artificial way.
How would you define that in terms of these experiments?
It's a long discussion, but I don't think it's Kil'aim. It's prohibited. And they said everything Kodesh Baruch Hu enabled us to do, and does not do any damage. I think it is permitted. The question is whether really we are afraid of a damage, or more than that, we are afraid of new things that we never saw before. We wake up to a world that is not like the world that we saw before. It scares us. And I don't know, I'm too old to be scared, already from the whole new world.
Yes, any other questions? Yes, Jerry.
Well, the chimera experiment always puzzled me because it doesn't make any difference to me whether you use a human nerve cell or a mouse nerve cell or a worm's nerve cell. They're all nerve cells. It's like making a computer and a different kind of resistor. But there's something human about the organization, which would never happen in a mouse developing with human cells. And I wonder whether halakhic law talks about organization and some supracellular.
It sure does. It talks about the soul.
Let me just repeat the question, if I may. Yes, Dr. Fishbach says that on a cellular level, he is not as concerned about the introduction of human into animal tissue, whether it's a nerve cell of a mouse or a human or a rabbit, it's a cell. But where he can see more cause for concern is in the organizational level with organs and tissues interacting. Am I correct?
Yeah, or what gives rise, as was raised, to human thought and emotion and consciousness?
Or what gives rise to human thought, emotions, etc.
It's something mysterious that has totally independent of the cellular component.
Oh, there we get to the blush factor, perhaps.
I like that.
You like that. Professor, you want to comment on that?
I think that it's an emergent property of human nerve cells, actually, and therefore I don't think that if you put together enough mouse neurons in the right synaptic conformations and you made them in a large box, etc., that you'd end up with a human brain that would emerge to be a mind. I also believe, as a believing Jew, that there's an element beyond the biological that God puts us in.
So that emergent property is key. And how does that happen? And is that related to this notion of Golem?
Well, I really can't speak about golems, but I would, like I said, I don't think it's a scientific thing that bothers me. I think it's more of a, a gut feeling kind of thing, that if you had a brain that would be totally human cells, I think it could wire itself in such a way that there might be some human emergent properties. But that's a speculation. But you're absolutely right in a sense that this experiment I didn't mention is not only that it was done, but it didn't work. I mean, the human embryonic stem cells in the mouse embryo did manage to divide and proliferate and make any components at all of the embryos, and the embryos stopped developing. So so this kind of experiment, meanwhile, can't be done. But the emergent properties, I don't know how one would get there. I think that if you had enough of a cerebellum, a human cerebellum, that you might be able to get, the mouse might have control that would allow playing a miniature piano or something like that. Whether you'd get something that could argue, I'm not sure.
Rabbi Altschul?
I guess this is the right session for this question. Many of us remember as students when we couldn't sleep at night watching movies after 1 o'clock in the morning. And some of those movies involved the disembodied brain that destroyed the world. We have Hitler's brain. And the sense, if it were possible to transplant, and I guess I speak to the neurologists here, a brain, because we're transplanting many other organs that we never dreamed of being able to do before, would that change the personality? Would that define personality? Would that define humanity?
So Rabbi Altschul asks a fanciful question. For those of you who ever saw movies of where a brain per se can take over the world, or Hitler's brain, or some movie like that, raising the question of if it were ever scientifically possible to transplant a brain into another human being, an animal, an ape,
Yes.
would that be permissible, appropriate, desirable, whatever?
Also,
Would it confer the qualities of humanism, humanity?
The brain of a Kohen, the person who was in
Yes.
Israel, would now be a
Yes.
Kohen.
You know, I have to bring a little bit of my work because I don't deal with golems. We do have this issue of what is the ethical status of an anencephalic baby, which is the opposite way of looking at it. Children born basically without cerebral cortex and only with a brainstem, and some people feel that they lack that human quality, so to speak, and they can be taken for organ donors. But just putting that aside, would somebody like to address the issue of the transplantation of a human brain?
The brain of what Winston Churchill used to call Corporal Schicklberger was not such a great thing when it was in his own body, so I don't know if it'll be much better when it'll be outside of the body. He lost the war and made every possible mistake. But the question of what is the person and what are the spare parts, this is a real question that should be addressed. We spoke about it when we had the Nitzotzot convention of brain-machine interface. What is the limit between the person and the spare parts? Is the person the brain or not? Listen, we have to leave something, for further discussions. As far as the anencephalic, I just wanted to microphone for the anencephalic baby. I don't think that something can be something that is of human origin can be defined as non-human just because it lacks an ability. You said about the power to argue. When I get married, I don't become an inhuman. I stop arguing. The thing is that whether you are considered to be alive or not, this is a different issue. You can be a human, but a dead human being or non-living. A person did not start living because he lacks the cortex. This is.
Let me ask the panel this, because before we disband, it was raised before the issue of transplanting this fox gene. I still haven't got it right. 2B.
2P.
2P. This fox gene, which confers the power of speech. How would you view if somebody wished to do an experiment of transplanting that gene in an ape? Or in a chimpanzee, how would you view that halachically, scientifically, etc.? Would that give you the same yuck or gut factor, Professor or Rabbi? What do you think about that?
As I said before, I don't see any problem. The problem will be really whether do I see this chimpanzee as a big molecular biology computer that its speech is no different than my speaking computer. My computer can speak also. Doesn't make it human. Is there any difference between molecular biology computer or molecular biology machine? Soon they'll have biological computers and a speaking ape. If there is no difference, it doesn't make it any human. I don't see why not. Then why not to do it? I don't think it'll convert the ape to human in any way.
Professor, you want to?
I agree 100% with the rabbi. I assume that you meant me. You said professor. You meant me. I don't think that. Well, first of all, you have things like parrots that speak, that have the capacity to make sounds that sound like human speech, and it isn't dependent on this particular gene or on this form of this particular gene, and that doesn't make them cognizant or anything else. The idea of transferring one gene from one species to another, I don't think would confer enough of anything that it would even give me a yuck factor, to tell the truth.
John? Oh, wait, let me ask some of the, yes, sir.
אני ברשותכם אשאל שאלה בעברית, את המלאכה לתרגם. השאלה הראשונה היא, האם ערימה של תאים אנושיים, מתי הם מתחילים להיות בעייתיים מבחינת ההגדרה של אדם? הרי ערימה של תאים זה ערימה, ואין לה את הצד הרוחני, הנפשי, הנשמה שלה. ואם כן, אז אפשר יהיה לברוא או לבנות או ליצור גולם שהוא ערימה של תאים בלי נשמה, וממנו ליצור כל מיני דברים שאנחנו צריכים, ואז אין לנו בעיה.
The question, I think, and correct me because my Hebrew is not as good as yours, Rabbi, human cells, when do they begin to acquire the aspect of humanity? And if so, is it possible, do you say, just to create a pile of humans or a conglomeration of human cells such that they would be able to be useful in terms of organ donation and so forth?
They become human when they fall asleep during a lecture. This is the definition. And when they start behaving like human beings, and otherwise...
I agree 100%. That's what we do for a living. We try to make cells in piles of cells that are nerve cells, that so maybe someday they could be transplanted to someone's brain, but we never thought about burying the cells that don't work at the end of the experiment. I don't think there's any humanity. The same way that if you were to receive a portion of a fetus from an abortion and you do an experiment on that, well, what would be left, you might want to bury this, or from pathology specimen that has humanity, came from a human being. But these cells were never human. They were in a tissue culture dish, and there was no ever being in a womb or being any other kind of humanity to them. So I don't think that there's an issue with that. That's the goal, actually, of a lot of medicine, regenerative medicine.
Professor Riddell.
I would like to address some of the questions done earlier here. Human, maybe it is a momentary definition. Meaning we assume that if we are going to find a definition, that's going to be an answer. No, this definition is the starting point for a development. So whatever we're going to say now is a temporary attempt to find a solution to our problem, which is going to change in the moment we are going to have a solution. Now, I would say, if it's possible to extrapolate from my learning some text, is, again, speaking or understanding is not enough. And I would add now the idea of creativity, meaning the moment when someone becomes beyond the two faculties, which are in principle can be statical, is when they are starting to work dynamically. Also, this can become part of artificial, and then we shall have to change the human definition. But for the time being, I would say the possibility to change or to create or to argue is the moment in which what is the given is transcended. And that I would prefer now to call human, which maybe is going to be transcended in a year or two.
I just want to point something out, Owen. To this audience, I am speaking now because I straddle the world of secular ethics and Jewish medical ethics, which I know something about, although do not pretend to be an expert. I think what I am taking from this discussion, I would say that the Jewish attitude, the halachic attitude, the attitude of the scientists that we have heard, is really more permissive in these issues than many of the secular people and countries, their attitude towards it. I mentioned to you before, what I heard from John, that laws were passed in Europe prohibiting the type of transplant that we were considering. And so I sense, and I could be wrong, I sense that we are more lenient in this regard, that Judaism has a more pragmatic attitude towards this without violation of certain basic principles that allows for greater exploration in these areas. I don't know if you agree with that, but I sense that there's a greater permissiveness there, and perhaps society will evolve along these lines. But I sense less of a hesitation in branching out than I do in the secular world. So that's my observation. John?
Just like to point out something very interesting. In secular bioethics, we have 4 principles: justice, beneficence, non-maleficence, and autonomy. And yet, when you're dealing with this issue, any objection comes up with a 5th. It's called the yuck factor. And that's what Leon Katz called it. There's no principle, just it sounds yucky, and we shouldn't do it.
לא תשקצו.
Can I?
So keep that in mind.
Yes,
Can I
the
offer-
fact, yes, go right ahead.
What was the question?
Let me repeat this for what Dr. Loiky is saying. The 4 typical principles we hear in medical ethics, which were really enunciated by the Georgetown, it's called the Georgetown Mantra, people who wrote the first edition of the principles of bioethics back in the 1970s. They enunciated 4 principles of bioethics: autonomy, autonomy, people have the right to choose what they do or don't want done to themselves. Beneficence, doctors and scientists should do things for the good of humanity. Non-maleficence, we should not do bad. And justice, we should have equal distribution of resources, etc., and act equally. There is a 5th principle, I think the rabbi mentioned yesterday, about sanctity of life, which frankly I always incorporate in my talks because it's implied or implicit. It's inconceivable. It should be number 1, actually. But then there is, let me say, the 6th factor then that Dr. Loiky mentions, which is the yuck factor. Yuck is an English expression for ugh, magil. It makes you nauseous. And when something, you can't put your finger on it, but there's something not right about this, and I don't think we should proceed along these lines, even though I cannot enunciate specifically why. And sometimes this so-called yuck factor is operative. I will tell you, though, that yuck factors can mutate or can be subdued over time, whereas autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficence, and justice are stable. They're engraved. How you interpret them is a different thing, but the yuck factor has a way of changing with time. It used to be, did you want to say something about that?
No, I agree.
Yeah. So anyway, this yuck factor may be something that some of the secular societies, as I mentioned before, are dealing with now, and over time this may change. I guess we've gone over time. It's been a very stimulating, I think we have to stop now. Thank you all very much. Thank you, panel. It's been a wonderful discussion.